Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Web Platform Podcast, episode number 173. Today we're talking about Nuxt.js. We are your hosts this week, Leon Revel, Danny Blue, Eric Isaacson, Amal Hussein. Amal is not here, and neither is Eric, but I'm announcing them either way because we missed them and we hope they will join us soon. Leon, Danny, how's it going?
Good, thanks.
Yeah, it's going pretty good.
Another day, another dollar, or some such, or code, or broken tests. My screen is just filled with red at the moment. It's always a good sign when your tests are failing. Is that right? I think I might have that backwards. But let's not talk about tests. Let's talk about this week in the web in 2 minutes or less with Leon. Leon, what's going on in the web this week?
Thanks, Justin. So first of all, plans for the next iteration of Vue have just been detailed in a blog post, which was published by Ivan Yu. So check that out to see what is in Vue's future. Parcel version 1.10 has just been released, which provides support for Babel 7, Elm, and includes loads of other improvements. There's also a new minor version of Stencil, which has been released, and that reduces dependency size and also provides a range of bug fixes. TypeScript 3.1 has been released, and that includes new features such as mappable, tuple, and array types, easier declaration of properties and functions, and a load more. So go and check out that link to find out all the stuff that's in the new version of TypeScript. And quite relevant to this episode, Nuxt.js 2 has just been released recently, so stay tuned to hear all about that in this episode. And that's everything from me for This Week in Web. Thank you, Justin.
Thank you, Leon. So it's October, so now it's the time for releases. This is when all the releases start to happen and the leaves change colors. And legitimately, I don't know how those two things are together, but to me, they make sense. It all makes sense to me. Pour yourself a pumpkin spice something and hope for the best. No one should ever release software that way. How did you release that release last night? Well, I poured myself some pumpkin spice and then I just let it roll.
Not even in a drink, just a glass of pumpkin spice.
Just a glass of pumpkin spice. Yeah, that's the way you really do it in pumpkin land. But we're not talking about pumpkins this week, although we probably could. Today we're talking about Nuxt.js, and we want to welcome our guest this week, Sébastien. Hello, welcome to the show.
Hello, Justin. Thank you for having me at the web platform. And talking about releases, that was pretty funny because we released Nuxt 2 a week ago at Vue.js London, and we did an npm published live in front of 500 person. And actually it went well, so I definitely recommend everyone to try it.
Oh, wow, cool.
You're a brave soul, sir. Brave soul.
Yeah, I was really stressed, by the way.
So Sébastien, tell people a little bit about yourself for those who don't know you out there on the web.
Okay, I'm Sébastien Chopin. My brother, Alex Chopin, is also the creator of Nuxt.js. I've been doing JavaScript since I'm 14. I was doing web games with PHP, and I was using JavaScript with jQuery and trying to make some AJAX request when it was super popular back then. And I did a lot of Node.js. I started when it was 0.6, and then I started developing with Backbone.js mostly. I've seen Angular, React, and my brother recommended me to look at Vue.js, and then I fell in love three years ago. And then I'm into Vue and Node.js mostly. Yeah.
So you've seen the progression of the web sort of from the days of yore. That's what I like to call them, days of yore. This is
it's pretty hard to see everything that is going on the web. I think I've mostly seen the Node.js environment. I can't say I've seen everything on the web platform. There is too many stuff going on. But JavaScript mostly, yeah. And I'm really happy of how it's going, and looking forward to see how it will look like in 5 years.
definitely an exciting time to be on the web. I feel like there's a new API every day, something shiny to play with, and it is indeed hard to keep up. And with so much predilection these days towards performance, Next.js. I mean, how did Next.js really come about for you? Like, why Next.js?
Okay, so that's pretty funny story how it started. I was redoing my e-commerce website, which is an e-commerce website for selling massage beds, and it's made with Node.js. And I was like, let's try to put Vue.js on it. And because server-side rendering, I mean, for SEO, it's really important. Let's try to put it with Vue server render module and do it from scratch. And I was doing it, it was working. And then one day I was on my bed looking at Twitter, and I've seen this article about Next.js for React. And I just love the philosophy of it, since he remind me PHP, where you create pages and it creates routes automatically. And I don't know, I made the promise to myself to do the same for Vue and to meet Guillermo one day in person. And that was my promise to create Nuxt. And yeah, that's how it started. And there was a lot of night where I didn't sleep, trying to see a way of doing it, because it was not possible to do the same way as Next did. And yeah, I think can't remember. It was like these kind of days where you're working during all night, and so you don't really know when is the day, when is the night. And yeah, I did a prototype. It was working, and then that's how it started. Someone tweeted about it, and it started to get popular. So I had to put a warning, like, it's not production ready. I didn't expect this popularity, honestly, when I created Nuxt. But I've seen a lot of people liking it, and it was a great opportunity to build something great that people like. That's how it started.
So before we kind of get into any more detail, I mean, you've touched on kind of where Nuxt.js came from, but if you could just kind of clarify exactly what it is. Obviously, we've kind of touched on it. It's basically provides server-side rendering capabilities for Vue, but if you could just provide a bit more detail as to exactly what Nuxt.js is.
Yeah, that's a question people ask me a lot. It started as a framework to server-side render Vue.js application. That's how it started. Like 1 week after, my brother came and said, hey, you could generate static website with it. So right now, as 2018, Nuxt.js is a framework on top of Vue.js. So you can think of it as a meta framework, connecting core Vue library together and make it as simple as possible to use. So you start a Nuxt project, and then you have Vue, you have Vue router, you have the Webpack configuration, you have everything inside that makes you as much productive as we can. So you can start working on writing Vue file, writing JavaScript, and just develop your website like you were doing with PHP back then, but way more powerful.
Because trying to get all of these complex server-side rendered setups working can be quite difficult. So the idea of Nuxt.js is just to kind of provide best practices and a way to do that really, really easily. Is there some kind of like CLI tools or something that allows you to kind of get going into a Nuxt project really quickly, or how does the kind of onboarding process work?
So just before Nuxt 2.0, we had some Vue templates giving you the basic of a Nuxt application. But from now on, we have a tool called Create Nuxt App. So it's like Create React App. So you use it, and then it will ask you some question. What server framework do you want to use? If it's Express, Koa, Adonis.js, or even just the Nuxt.js core, and what front-end library you want to use. So it's really a CLI tool to make you start quickly, the Create Nuxt App. And then you choose your front-end framework if you want to use Bootstrap, Vuetify, Tailwind. And then we also ask you what modules do you want. If you want to use Axios because you're going to make API request. So with this, in less than 1 minute, you have a Nuxt.js project and you can start developing your pages, your components, and without worrying about your configuration.
And that's extremely powerful. Just not having to think about the tooling is really important. It's like, okay, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use Nuxt, and it's just going to tell me what to do. I think sometimes folks underestimate how nice it is to have maybe a bit more of a restricted sandbox to work in. And it's like, okay, I trust that this tool that I'm using is going to do what is best for me.
Yeah, that's actually what we are trying to achieve, taking all the best practice of the Vue world. It's about server-side rendering, but also single-page application, trying to give the right folder structure, because it's pretty hard to guess how you have to structure your application from if it's a big one or a small one. We're trying to give you the structure so it can work 90% of the time. And because we don't like framework that lock you inside a configuration that you can't change, Nuxt is customizable with modules or hooks. You can change all the behavior of Nuxt if you need to tweak it for your specific application. So yeah, giving best practices so people can start working without trying to understand how Webpack works, how Babel works. It can be really hard for some agencies to start working on Vue if they have to understand all this building process behind. That's how it started, and that's how I think it started to be popular as well, because they were just starting this project, writing Vue files, and they have server-side rendering with the client-side iteration, so it feels like a really fast web application, and they were just writing HTML and CSS.
That's awesome. So one thing, so Nuxt is obviously more than just server-side rendering, but you mentioned that that's kind of how all this stuff got started, and also that you maybe had to do it differently than some other. So you said you referred to Next, which is a similar type of thing for React. Can you dive in a little bit on how the server-side rendering works in Nuxt?
Okay, so talking about server-side rendering, it's really, really simple. We simply use the official Vue server rendered module by the Vue team, and then we have this application that you write that we give to Vue server rendered. And because we use Vue router behind, we know which page you want to server render. And from that, we are able to fetch the data of your page you need. And then we call this Vue server render module like React has, and it sends us back the HTML that we give back to the. It's a bit more complex than this, but by just talking without any schemas, it will be pretty hard. But we are using the Vue server rendered official module. So we give it the application, it gives us back the HTML. Then we hydrate the HTML, and it feels like a client-side application. I can go more into the details if you want, but I think we have a schemas about this.
Yeah, no. So I would love to hear a few more details. That you one thing that you said is that you hydrate or rehydrate. Can you explain briefly what that is? Because I know it actually wasn't very long ago for me that I actually learned what that term meant. So can you explain exactly what that piece means?
Yeah, I will try to explain the universal application world, because it's kind of not so many people knows about this. It's pretty new as well. So a universal application, which you can also call it as isomorphic, which was the name back then, but it's less marketing, let's say. It's an application that runs, in this case, because of Nuxt and Vue.js, it's JavaScript that will run both on server side and client side. So most of your application is shared. So it can run on Node.js, but it can also run on the browser. So the advantage is really great since you share the same code base. But most of all, when you server render your application, there is this hydration step. So Vue.js will look at the generated HTML that Vue server rendered sent back, he will create the same application that ran on the server side. He will look at the virtual DOM that he has and try to match every HTML tag that he can, like, it's like you have a spider and you have this spider web. And this is the HTML generated from server side. And then Vue will create another spider web and it will try to match them together. And if it's a perfect match, which is most of the time a perfect match, it will take over on the client side, which means that when you will do any kind of interaction or navigation, if you click on a link, it will be handled fully on client side, which means for every new user on your website, only one request will be handled on server side. And then when the JavaScript will be loaded, all of his interaction and navigation will be handled only on client side. So the performances are great since it's only when a new user is coming that it will hit the server.
That was a really good explanation. So given the isomorphic nature of this, what are the kind of considerations that developers have to take when building their components? So from what I understand with Nuxt is you're able to just write Vue components to build up your different parts of your user interface. But assuming there must be some kind of things you need to think about, knowing that these components are essentially going to get rendered on the server. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is maybe the second most asked question we have. And since you are in a universal environment, which means your component you're creating are run both on server side or client side, this means that you cannot use some platform-specific APIs. To give you an example, on Node.js, window is undefined. So if your component is relying on window for doing some kind of interaction with the browser, it won't work on server side because it will throw an error that window is not defined. So when you're developing these components for Vue, or even if you're creating a library, if you want to make it compatible with server-side rendering, you just have to make sure to check if window exists. So you know you might run on server side. And you can only use window, for example, in these hooks on Vue, which called like before mount or mounted. These hooks are called only on client side. So you can use these platform-specific APIs in these hooks. So that's one consideration to take when you're creating Vue components or Vue library that will work on server side. The second one, which is pretty important and can lead to memory leaks, is to be aware. So we are working a lot on the documentation for all these server-side caveats, is that on Vue.js, you have lifecycle hooks. You have before create, created, before mount, mounted, before destroy, and destroyed. I hope I didn't miss anyone. Created and before create are the only ones that are called on server side. So this means that let's say you create a library and you decide to create a mixin, and that will, on every component, for example, on the created hook, you start a timer. If you start a timer and this component is run on server side, the timer will start, but because destroyed is never called on server side, there is no way to clear this timer. So the garbage collector won't be able to clear these variables, these timers. So it can lead quickly to any memory leaks. Every time someone will refresh the page, the component will be run on server side, and then the created hook will be called, and the new variable will be stored in memory, and etc. So when you're dealing with server side, and I think most of the time is mostly a best practice to create some timers or any kind of cache data that you need inside before mount or mounted hook.
And so stuff like that can be really tricky. Again, when you have to think about the fact that you're going to have a component. This is not specific to Nuxt. This is just in general. I think it's the same in React, honestly. It's the yeah, it's the same type of thing, just in general. In any framework, that a lot of times you take for granted certain APIs that are going to be there. I mean, like even things like decoding and encoding, like base64 encoding and decoding is done differently in the browser versus in Node. So there's a lot of stuff like that you have to figure out how to get.
Yeah, definitely.
So documentation, I imagine, becomes extremely important to making sure that people don't fall into these traps.
Mm-hmm. That's our main focus. Teaching people how to write universal code is, I think, the best way, because it doesn't take so much time to learn. It's just some best practice. But when you know them, your library and your component can run on universal application. And for me, I believe universal application are the future. And it's not so much work. I remember when I was doing pull requests for libraries, just to add the type of window is different than defined to make them work on server side. It's really small steps, but it helps a lot to create universal application, make your code respect the best practices. So yeah, documentation, that's our main point for that.
So I will say the documentation is very good because as someone who does not use Nuxt.js very often, I haven't put it into prod anywhere at the current junction. I do actually answer a lot of questions about it based on the documentation because it comes up in other repositories that I answer questions in. So in performance repositories and Lighthouse and things. So it's come up like, oh, hey, I'm doing this and I don't see this because it's failing an audit. And oh, well, let's go look and see how it works. So it works very well. Like, and again, like as people who listen to the show know, I'm a big fan of documentation. Documentation, I think, is underrated in most cases. And your all's documentation is very good as a whole. Like, it's just super useful.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, maybe.
So Justin, it's got the Justin documentation seal of approval, has it? Is that?
I do. Yeah. Where is that seal? Where's the design? If you're a designer out there, you're thinking, you know what? I want to waste time on something.
I want that seal.
Coming to a GitHub page near you.
About the documentation, it was really, really important for me because that's how I felt in love with Vue. It was because of the documentation, honestly. Documentation was so great. I was reading it like a book, and I wanted to do the same with Nuxt. Well, that was harder than I thought, but that was our standard. If you create a Vue library or Vue framework, you gotta be as good as the Vue documentation. So that's maybe why we work so much on the documentation. But I mean, without great documentation, it's hard to explain a great framework or a great library. So yeah.
Yeah, and just iterating what Justin already said, it is great documentation. Like, it really helped me, get up and running with Nuxt. So yeah, well done on that, certainly. I would like to talk a little bit about the relationship between Vue and Nuxt, and I don't necessarily mean the code. I mean, from the Vue authors and that. Like, do you talk a lot to each other, or is there some kind of relationship there, or is it kind of completely independent?
We have a great relationship with Vue. I think when I presented Nuxt on a lightning talk at Nuxt.js, it was in 2016. I've met Evan Yu, and I was just showing him Nuxt.js. I think it was for him the first time it was for us the first time we met. And yeah, he invited me to the Vue.js Slack, and since then we talk. I'm talking with them. We have some channels for Nuxt, some channels for server-side rendering. So when there is some updates for Vue server rendered about this famous fix that React did, and Vue.js did the same, so we were coordinated with the React team, the Vue team, to make the patch on the same time and release it. So yeah, we have a great connection with Vue.js core team. We also did some pull requests actually to the Vue ecosystem when we were working on the Webpack 4 support. to help them support Webpack 4 as well. So we help each other and we communicate a lot. I'm seeing them a lot on the Vue.js conference. Actually, it's doing great. We also have access to the next Vue 3, so we can already start implementing some changes for Nuxt to support Vue 3. So yeah, it's great communication.
No, that's really good to hear. I think doesn't like on the Vue website actually recommend Nuxt as a library as a framework to use for the server-side rendering story? Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. Yeah,
cool.
I was so happy
Excellent.
when I've seen that.
Yeah, because that's how I think I found Nuxt from that way. So I'm sure lots of people get pushed to Nuxt that way. So that's really good that you've got a good relationship going on.
Yeah, they are amazing. Honestly, I love the Vue community because I also really like the core team. They're open-minded people and they don't feel any kind of competition. We are all helping each other and trying to push boundaries to make Vue as great as possible. Cool. And we all have some project that can touch the boundaries of the others, but we always try to find a solution that it all connects together in a great way.
So, with a project like Nuxt, there's always a lot of talk about, the value between, obviously sort of the isomorphic code base, and you get a lot of value from that. But from a server-side rendering standpoint, I mean, there are lots of sort of gotchas in there, in terms of how that actually affects performance. Things like, well, I might render quickly, but maybe my server has overhead because of the nature of the processing that I do, or maybe I'm using the wrong connection types at the client level. So maybe I'm using old HT11 connections as opposed to H2 stuff. So, from Nuxt standpoint, like, how do you start to sort of bridge those gaps? Like, how do you say, hey, don't run your server with an H11 connection because that's bad, or I'm sorry, bad's probably not the right word, performant. How do you sort of bridge those gaps between server-side rendering is not a magic bullet that will make everything better? You do have to actually work for it. Like, you do have to turn on certain settings, and you do have to take these things into account.
Yeah, that's a good question. We try to make sure that when you use Nuxt directly, the Nuxt server, we put everything, we configure everything so it's as fast as possible, so you won't have any performances issue. Same as Vue server render, for example. You have different mode. One is really secure when you restart a VM every time there is a new request, but it takes a lot of memory. It's pretty slow. So we've seen with Evan how we can optimize everything. But this leads to some security issue if you have some sessions on your universal application. So what we have with Nuxt is called the Nuxt modules. So we've wrapped some libraries that works both on server side and client side. And the point of this is to give more security and give less headache for the people using it. One example is Axios. For instance, Axios is great because it works both on client side and server side. But what's happening if you want to use an API, but you don't have cross request origin, for example? So on client side, it won't work. On server side, it will work. So you have to use a proxy. So we created a lot of modules that will help you using server-side rendering quickly. So if you install the Axios module with Nuxt, it will work directly. We have an option so you can use the proxy as well, so you won't have any issues with your API. We have a lot of wrapper on top of Nuxt, a lot of modules that will help you work quickly with Axios, JSON Web Token, PWA. So we try to fix these issues with modules.
Do you find developers sort of take to that, in terms of not just understanding that, how the modules themselves work to sort of bridge those gaps, but do people find it an easy sort of process to initially set up? Because every once in a while I hear someone sort of go down the road of, oh, I set this up and I'm done. Like I just did, I just didn't, I used a Nuxt create app and magically now I have a thing and I'm done. But that's usually not the case for most pieces of things. So your base defaults are solid, you would say, yeah?
Yeah, definitely.
And then from there, just a matter of how much you want to configure out, right, towards
Exactly.
whatever your performance target is. Yeah.
Exactly. If you want to go deep inside performances, we actually have a process for I missed this one, for the benchmarks. So we have different benchmarks depending on the server-side framework that you can use. And we want to make sure that the benchmarks are great. But if you want to configure, you can configure everything. So you can, like, for example, a module is a good way for you if you want to create a custom modules because you want to customize Nuxt.js core, if you want to disable the paging system or even the static middleware because you find it not as performant as you thought, you can disable it through modules by using hooks, add your own middleware, or you also can use Nuxt programmatically. Like Nuxt is a simple npm module. It's just a node module that you can use. You can require Nuxt and then call Nuxt build and Nuxt render route. So it's up to you if you want to go deep and if you have specific needs, you can go deeply inside Nuxt, use it as a module and do what the you want. That's
Yeah, no, I think the flexibility there is very key. I think sometimes we get into the habit of, we want things to be turnkey performant, but that's really not the case, right? We have good base defaults for some things, but sometimes you can't get out of the base defaults either, depending on what kind of thing you're working on. So it's nice to see the flexibility in there.
Yeah, it's super hard to give great standards, but also giving the possibility to change the core if they want, because you don't want your user to be stuck with the framework they can't configure. We don't want to have a nuxt.config.js file that is 1,000 lines of code. So that's why we have this module system. So you can definitely change some part of Nuxt through modules. It was a great idea from our core contributor, Puya. And since then, every time we have a feature request that someone wants to add a new feature into Nuxt, if it can be done with a module, and 99% of the time it's yes, it has to be made with a module. So we have a core which is pretty light, and then you can extend it with modules or just change also the core of Nuxt with modules.
So my next question is tied to web components specifically. So again, anybody that is listening to this show knows that we are on the show are fans of platform features and are in general fans of web components. I'm curious, really, because I just don't know, how does Nuxt treat things like in general, custom elements, which is something that the custom element integration with Vue is very good. So I'm curious what Nuxt would do with web components, and then complicated things like Shadow DOM. I'm curious what Nuxt does if it can do anything.
Well, actually, since Nuxt is mostly generating a Vue application, you can do the same as Vue. That's what is really important to understand. Nuxt is mostly a generator of your Vue application. So if you run Nuxt, you will see that you have a .nuxt folder. And if you look into it, it's just a Vue application that supports server-side rendering. So what you can do with Vue, you can do it with Nuxt. So for instance, for the Shadow DOM, I'm not an expert of it, but I know Vue use the virtual DOM internally. So with this in mind, you have an attribute named scoped for your style tag in your Vue component that you can use. And Vue will automatically add an attribute to any DOM. So your CSS will not have any side effect on other DOM elements. If you put the scoped attribute, let's say you have a paragraph component with Vue or Nuxt, but it's just a Vue component. You have an H1, a P tag, and in your style, you just add the scoped attribute, and you can directly say P, and you put the CSS like color blue, then this CSS won't affect other elements since it's scoped and Vue has a kind of shadow DOM implementation inside this Vue transpiler.
So what about native? What if you were using a vanilla web that made use of Shadow DOM inside of your Vue application? Do you know how Nuxt would treat that?
Honestly, I never tried. I can't answer you, but I'm really
Okay.
looking forward to see how it works, and I think it will work automatically. If it won't, we will find a way to make them work. Because that's really important to support generic web components from my point of view.
Okay, cool. That's good to hear.
Such a hard thing.
Well, for me, I'm just thinking about Svelte.js, which is a great framework, a great library, and that just transpile in web components since you use Svelte as a dev dependency. So yeah, supporting these web components, generic web component is really important. I think, yeah, the trickiest part would be server-side rendering. But I believe that if the web component is static data, that won't be a problem.
Say Shadow DOM and server-side rendering 3 times, Trey shows up to to help push forward the spec for that, because there's been a lot of conversations around sort of the, how do you do declarative Shadow DOM? Like how do you render that thing on a server side, or how do you allow it to be composed in a different sort of declarative nature as opposed to imperative? I think it's a hard problem to solve at the moment.
It's one of the big questions around web components still, isn't it? I'm trying to find good solutions, but I've seen that Trey has done quite a lot of work on that, so that's good. But the Vue and Nuxt story for web components on the front end is brilliant, really, really good. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't have any answers in terms of what would happen trying to render it on the server side at the moment. But I'm sure there is some answers out there we'll find.
Yeah, I think so.
So as we've said quite a few times in the episode already, Nuxt.js is a lot more than just server-side rendering on top of Vue. There's lots of other features, such as a code splitting. Could you talk a little bit about how that works, or automatic code splitting? I think it says on the site. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, since Nuxt.js has a Vue router inside, and since Vue and Vue router support code splitting naturally, it all depends. Honest, Vue support the Webpack syntax for lazy loading. So instead of having import my component from the path, you just say const component equal a function that return import my component. So if you give to Vue not the component, but the function that will load the components through Webpack code splitting definition, it will automatically code split your application since we depend on Webpack. And so when we say automatic code splitting, because of our pages directory, which look like a bit like PHP. So if you create an index.vue file inside pages, it will generate the /root. If you create about, it will generate the /about. For dynamic pages, if you create _slug.vue, it will create this semicolon slug semicolon slug. So because you created your routing by creating files, we know your routing, so we can code split automatically the pages component for you. And we have options so you can disable them, or you can also use a module if you don't want to use the pages directory. So that's how we do automatic code splitting, through the pages directory.
Cool. That certainly sounds like it's going to make things simpler. But it's basically utilizing some of the features available in Webpack to do that alongside the way that it's structured, etc. Cool. I'd also like to ask about where can you deploy Nuxt.js applications? Does it have to be just like a standalone node server, or can you put it on Firebase or any other kind of those?
That's a great question. So what I didn't talk about of Nuxt, and we are going to change the homepage to make it clear. You can use Nuxt for three different type of application. You can use it to create universal application. This you will need to host it on a Node.js server. So this you can host it on Heroku, on Now, from Zeit. You can host it on Firebase. I think remember Firebase did a tutorial to host it on them. We have also a FAQ where you can look at how you can deploy your application, your Nuxt application. And then we have this other feature. For me, it's pretty great. We had it from the beginning. That's the idea of my brother, since he was so much into Jekyll. And I remember when we explained this feature that was in front of Evanio the first time we met him. And I think, it took a little bit of time to understand what the was going on. It's called Nuxt generate. So when you run this command, it will automatically, because we know your routing, it will generate your routes like a static website. So if you call Nuxt generate, it will generate all your routes, save it into HTML file. It will also save the bundle. So then you can host it on any static hosting, like Netlify, Surge, GitHub Pages. Our documentation was on GitHub Pages at the beginning. So this is one great feature. And of course, you can't use it if you have sessions on your website. But for blog, for documentation, for any kind of static website you can make, you can use it with Nuxt as well. And the third mode we have, the third option is to use the single page application mode. If you don't care about server-side rendering, but you like the Nuxt philosophy of having a pages directory, having modules, plugins, you can set the mode to SPA, and then you will simply generate a dist folder, like for the generate, and you can host it on any static hosting, like same Netlify, Surge, even Zeit has static hosting. So it all depends of what do you use Nuxt for. If you want a universal application, then it will be a Node.js hosting service. And we will make sure that it's clear in the documentation. It was not super clear right now, but it's a framework on top of Vue, so you can use it for universal, static generated, or single page application.
Cool. So it sounds like there's lots of options that'll meet pretty much most use cases. So that's really good to hear. So we are running up against time, unfortunately, and I think it'd be a real shame if we didn't get a chance to talk about the latest release of Nuxt. So if you'd like to provide us with details of like the main highlights of that release and kind of what it's all about, that would be great.
Yeah. So mostly for Nuxt 2.0, we waited a long time because it was kind of ready March, but since Webpack 4 was released a few weeks before, and they had some breaking changes for the plugins, we wanted to make sure that most of the plugins were updated. So when we were releasing Nuxt 2, people using Webpack plugin inside Nuxt won't have any issues with that. So Webpack 4, we had it since their release, Babel 7. So this means faster build. And one of the crazy ideas we had is to support ECMAScript directly, the latest ECMAScript features for your Nuxt config.js, so you don't have to use module.exports, even if it's running into Node 8. It's the same for the server middleware. I didn't have the time to talk about this feature, but it's in the documentation. And same as for the modules. So you have a module for Nuxt, and you can use export default even if it's running to Node, because we use the ESM module, which is great. And then we introduce Nuxt Start, which is a runtime only, and it's perfect for production, for faster install if you use some Docker, if you want to. So you can use Nuxt as a dev dependency and use Nuxt Start as a dependency. So it will be faster to install on servers. And since we use async and await inside Nuxt core, we don't support Node lower than 8. So we created Nuxt Legacy for people still using Node 6, even if it's not recommended. And more feature in the release note, but that's not the biggest one. But a lot of bug fixes, better stability, And that's really our plan, making Nuxt more enterprise ready, so people can relax, use Nuxt, and know that they have all the features they need and the security as well. And yeah, that's our roadmap. That's what was inside Nuxt 2.0.
Cool. That sounds really good, and really cool to hear that you kind of released that during a conference. That's
Yeah,
brilliant.
that was a crazy idea. We prepared everything for sure, but yeah, I had the two-factor authentication for NPM, so I had to check my phone, put the code. But that was great fun. The public was awesome.
I'm sure there are a lot of folks out there that appreciate the legacy version as well, especially especially enterprises that maybe can't upgrade, for whatever reason can't upgrade their version of Node. I think that was a very good idea.
Yeah, actually, my website, my e-commerce website, still run Node 4, and like you say, it's not that easy to upgrade Node, and for us, legacy is also important, so people can still upgrade Nuxt 2 without having to upgrade Node.
Well, with that, for those out there who want to learn more about Nuxt or get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
You can go to our Nuxt.js.org website, and we have a Discord server. So that's the best way to get in contact quickly with us. If people has any issues, questions, they can use GitHub. We have GitHub. We are working on cmty.app, which will be a kind of forum on top of GitHub to make sure that issues are well sorted. I mean, questions, bugs, and features separated. And yeah, or they can, if people wants to do any kind of support or consulting, we have the core team that is available for some consultancy, and they can contact us at team@nuxt.js.org.
Fantastic. Well, Sébastien, thank you so much for coming on the show. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
Danny, Leon, closing thoughts before we wrap up episode number 173.
No, I think we covered it. Nuxt sounds awesome.
Thank you.
And with that, that's been episode number 173 of the Web Platform Podcast. Today, we've talked about Nuxt.js and all the wonderful things you can do with it, as well as features to come and more things platform. Tune in next week when we talk more about just how much on the web you can do. Look at all that API footprint. Look at all the magical libraries that are out there. We look forward to it, and we hope to see you next week.